years. He's written a screen reader for Windows and worked on the Windows accessibility team at Microsoft, and he occasionally plays parser-based interactive fiction. And he will be speaking, starting now.
All right, thank you. So I'm here to talk about accessibility in narrative games that aren't currently accessible, and how we can solve that problem. Before I get into the content of my talk, Zarf, can you tell me roughly how big the audience is here?
I can, as soon as I remember where the chat. Okay, so there's about 30 people in the room.
All right. So a few questions, and if you could raise your hand, show of hands, or respond in chat. How many
respond in chat?
Yeah. How many programmers here today?
Three or four.
All right.
6, 7 or 8.
All right. Anyone who has worked on engine or other low-level type code?
One from Olivia, Dave Cornelson, me, of course.
Yep. And anyone besides you, Zarf, who has implemented accessibility before?
Not seeing it. Oh, wait. One from Tess.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, cool. Zarf, you can go off and do other things, or just listen if you want, whatever. So thank you. So why am I here? I don't have the usual credentials of most people who have talked here. I'm only a casual player of narrative games, not a developer of games exactly. I'm here because I want there to be more accessible narrative games. And I mean, just imagine if you hear about this cool new interactive story that you want to experience, or a game that you just think would be fun to play, but you can't because it's not accessible to you. Maybe you're blind and you need to use a screen reader, and the game just doesn't it doesn't expose anything that a screen reader can read out loud. I've been in that situation before. Now I'm low vision. I have some limited vision, but I find that I'm using a screen reader more and more. So and historically, a lot of interactive fiction has been accessible by default, or perhaps accessible by accident would be an apt term, because it was just text. Certainly the Infocom games and games that have been written for the Infocom, for the Z Machine and later Glux, using Inform, and of course a lot of HTML based games using Twine and whatnot are more or less accessible as well, because they're just hypertext, and of course as long as they stick to text and standard links, they're fine. But a lot of newer narrative games from companies like Inkle and Failbetter and various other game studios that are putting out narrative games, and I don't mean to single out anyone in particular here. They're developed using mainstream game engines such as Unity or even Unreal, and these games tend to have no accessibility for blind people, unless they specifically implement something like a text-to-speech output option. And I think that we can and should solve that. And of course, narrative games have all different types of game mechanics, and some styles of gameplay are going to be more amenable to being made accessible than others. But I think that this is especially doable for narrative games, broadly speaking, because the game is about the story and generally not the gameplay mechanic itself. So before I get into details about what making these sorts of games accessible would entail, I want to do a quick demo. And for this demo, I am going to be running a modified version of a game called The Intercept that Inkle put out several years ago. They put it out as a demo of their Ink narrative scripting language, and the game uses the Unity game engine. And I'll spare you the unmodified version, but suffice to say, if you run it with a screen reader, you get nothing. So my collaborator, Arnold Lubria, and pardon my poor French pronunciation, but Arnold and I have been working lately on a modification of this game that is accessible with a screen reader using Unity. And I will, since the original game is open source and the modified version is also open source because I want people to use it as a starting point for bigger and better things, I'll be making available a link to the code repository later. But for now, let me share my screen and do the demo. Give me just a few seconds to get screen sharing going. And of course, the whole point of the demo is for you to hear what it's like. So I will be sharing my system audio as well.
.gather.town is sharing your screen and audio.
So I'm
Command prompt.
Start up this game.
C. Users Mac side projects greater.
Sorry.
C.
Now I'm going to start up this game.
C.
Got our Unity splash screen here.
The Intercept window.
Here we go.
Inkle presents. The Intercept. They are keeping me waiting.
So the title sequence was fully accessible. The screen reader automatically read each of the text snippets that appeared, and we've got our first bit of story text and our first choice. So, as is the custom with using a screen reader with a keyboard on Windows, I'm going to press Tab to move forward to the next, to the first button.
HUD 14 button.
That is our one choice at this point. If I press Tab again.
Settings button.
Yes, I'm aware of the extra word button there. That's an extra bit of polish that we didn't have time to do. And then if I hit Tab again, it wraps around.
HUD 14 button.
And then I can press Enter to make this choice.
The Intercept window. HUD 14. The door was locked after I sat down. I don't even have a pen to do any work. There's a copy of the morning's Intercept in my pocket, but staring at the jumbled letters will only drive me mad. I am not a machine, whatever they say about me.
Okay, so there's our next snippet of story text, and I'm going to Tab.
Think button.
Again.
Plan button.
Again.
Wait button.
One more time.
Settings button.
So those are our three choices, and let's plan.
Wait button. Plan button.
I'll press Enter.
The Intercept window. What I am is a problem solver. Good with figures, quick with crosswords, excellent at chess. But in this scenario, in this trap, what is the winning play?
I'm sorry, is there a problem? I just heard somebody talking, but...
No, there was no.
Okay, so, and you might have noticed that visually on screen, the text is being written out typewriter style, but the screen reader doesn't read each paragraph of text until it finishes typing. In theory, if a person was using a refreshable Braille device instead of speech output, then they could watch the text appearing incrementally, although that would lead to interesting artifacts in the translation from regular characters into Braille, particularly contracted Braille. But for all practical purposes, especially when using speech output, you really only want to get the text in complete chunks. So I can tab again.
Cooperate button.
And look through the choices, but I'm going to do something different this time to illustrate an important thing that particularly text-heavy games like this one need to have to be fully screen reader accessible, and that is screen readers have commands for reviewing and rereading what's on the screen, and so I'm going to move back to the previous bit of text.
But in this scenario, in this trap, what is the winning play?
All right, so you get the idea there, and I'm going to
142.
I'm going to press Alt F4 to exit this game.
Command prompt.
And let me just stop sharing my screen.
App.gather.stop.
There we go. So now I want to start talking about what it actually took to make that happen, and what game developers will need to do to make their games accessible. So, like I said, Unity, the game engine, doesn't have any support for, or maybe I didn't directly say this, but it's true. Unity doesn't have any direct support for screen reader accessibility in it. So this is an implementation that has been retrofitted on top of the Unity engine without support from Unity, the company. This is something we often have to do in accessibility, and the way that it works at a high level is, as you may know, in Unity there are game objects that get rendered in the scene, and each object can have one or more components that add behaviors to it. So for each of the objects that we want to be represented by a screen reader, in this case the text and buttons, we had an accessible node component that has various properties on it related to accessibility. What what is its role? For instance, is it a text or a button? What name does it have? And often that can be inferred from text inside the object. Can it receive keyboard focus? And one of the things that we needed to implement was a logic for moving the keyboard focus around when you press tab and shift tab. So the Unity's system of game objects and components made it fairly straightforward for us, when wearing our game developer hat, to add accessibility to the objects in the game. So what I'm getting at here is that once Arnold and I package up our work, our low-level work of the type that really should be in the engine itself, into a reusable plugin, it will be straightforward for game developers to implement accessibility, at least for simple text and choices games like this one. I'll go into a little bit of detail about what the low-level work entailed, because I know there are a few programmers in here who may be interested in that kind of thing. So I have been working off and on for the past several months on an open source project called AccessKit, which is not at all specific to games, but it's basically a set of libraries to make it easier for custom user interface toolkits of any kind to implement accessibility. And the goal is to make it cross-platform. Right now, there's only a Windows implementation. There will be a Mac implementation sometime later this year, and mobile platforms are coming. AccessKit itself is written in the Rust programming language, but it's designed to allow to be embedded in programs that are written in other languages as well. So whether you're using Unity or Unreal or any other engine that doesn't have built-in accessibility, AccessKit could be a good starting point for somebody to implement accessibility. On Windows, AccessKit implements an application programming interface, the API, provided by Microsoft called UI Automation. And one of the interesting things about UI Automation that makes this kind of retrofit more feasible now than it would have been, say, in the Windows XP era, or even just 10 years ago when UI Automation wasn't as mature, is that it doesn't rely on the main thread necessarily being responsive at all times. When I, at some point during the development of this demo, in desperation trying to work around a problem, I tried switching to the legacy accessibility API that was dependent on the main thread, and the game slowed. Well, at least when used with a screen reader, it slowed down very noticeably. So, and let's see, what do I want to talk about next? I'm really going off the cuff here. So I want to move up to a higher level and talk about challenges to making games accessible when the game is more complex than just text and choices. One thing that happens, of course, in a lot in games is cutscenes, where there's perhaps an animation with dialogue, and the animation is conveying important events that are happening in the story. To make something like that accessible, what you would want to do is take a cue from what movies and TV shows have been doing for the past few decades now, and look into something called audio description. And the way that works in movies and TV shows is someone writes a description of what's happening on screen, and then the description is recorded in short little 1 or 2 sentence snippets between lines, and then inserted between lines of dialogue on this alternate audio track. Now, for making a game accessible with screen readers, the description would be read using the screen reader's text-to-speech. And one thing you would have to watch out for there is that text-to-speech, people run their speech synthesizers at different speaking rates. I ran mine at a very, let's say, pedestrian rate, a lot of only for the purposes of doing the demo. I normally run mine much faster, but not every blind person is a power user who cranks up their speech speed. So writing descriptions that provide enough detail but don't step over the dialogue. Could be tricky, and so much so that you might it might actually be worthwhile to provide just a pre-rendered audio track for that. Sorry, just checking the time. Of course, a lot of games. So that's cutscenes. A lot of games, of course, have still pictures that that come up at various times, and for those, that's simpler. That's simpler. You basically do a similar thing to what has existed on the web basically forever, which is called alternate text for the image. In HTML, it's the alt attribute. For something like our Unity accessibility plugin, which, by the way, it's not actually a packaged up reusable plugin yet. We were hacking directly in our modified game repository, but we can certainly factor that out. But in something like that, you would set the name property on the accessibility node component. Hang on, I gotta see if somebody was messaging me on Discord. Okay, sorry, false alarm. So alternate text on images is important, and then of course, depending on what kind of puzzles you have in your game, some puzzles are inherently visual, so that could be a problem, and of course, I realize and accept that some games are going to be inherently more accessible than others, and that's fine. But my goal here is to at least share how games that are amenable to being made accessible, how we can make it easier to overcome the technical hurdles. And the main technical hurdle that I am seeking to overcome, and I guess I didn't really spell this out earlier when I was talking about AccessKit, is each platform, Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, the web, has its own API for implementing accessibility. And some of these APIs, I'm thinking particularly about the Windows one, require a programmer that has mastered esoteric knowledge about low-level programming for the platform that is kind of not so. I mean, there aren't so many programmers these days that have that skill. It's a specialized skill to implement one of these accessibility APIs from scratch. And really, the game engine developers such as Unity should be doing this, and hopefully if we keep advocating for this, they will. But I'm doing this AccessKit project in hopes that not only games but other applications can be made more accessible by clearing this technical barrier. So, and I'm particularly, in closing, I'm particularly interested in narrative games and making narrative games more accessible, because I think that one thing that's powerful about a well done interactive story is that the player can, to some extent, vicariously experience something that they may never get to live themselves. And for those of us that are disabled in one way or another, that's especially true. And I'll just, hang on. Am I getting messaged on? No, sorry. False alarm about Discord again. But as I was saying, for those of us that are disabled in one way or another, there are some experiences, even fairly common ones that we will never get to have directly. And I'll just call out one example of a narrative game that I would like to have access to, because not to single out a particular developer, but just because this makes my point. And a few years ago, a game called NeoCab was released, where you play the role of a driver in one of these rideshare type services, something along the lines of Uber. Now, I use Uber as a passenger fairly often, but short of a major scientific or technological breakthrough, I will never get to be an Uber driver. So I will not know directly what it's like to be on the other side of that. But if NeoCab is at least in part telling a story about the experience of being on the other side of that relationship, then I think it would be useful to make a game like that accessible so more of us can experience that. So with that, I am going to drop a few links in the chat. And I realize we're not going to have much time for Q&A at this point. So first, my email address. Next, the main Access Kit repository for anyone that wants to really get down and dirty with that low-level stuff. And finally, the GitHub repository with our proof of concept of an accessible Unity game. And again, special thanks to my collaborator, Arnold Lubria, for doing a lot of the heavy lifting on implementing that proof of concept. And with that, I hope that I have sparked some interest in working on this, and I will be happy to, probably at this point, just go ahead and move to a breakout room for Q&A. Zarf? Hang on.